The Mill Owner's Daughter.
Chapter 17. Late afternoon of April the 13th, a Sunday, found Irene Rose under some stress, convinced she was about to go into labour. Michael had carried her up to bed, and he and Janet were now in the pony and trap heading for Mary's kitchen to seek Mary Upton's assistance. Daniel Ackroyd had called round to the house earlier that morning with young Daniel. He'd picked up young David and Robert to take them for a walk. As Michael turned the pony into the yard, a voice hailed them. "Janet! Michael!" As they turned towards the sound, James Leach, Bernard McCartney and David Morrison came running towards them. Janet could hardly believe her eyes. She stood up and jumped out of the trap into the open arms of her lover, almost knocking him over in the process. They hugged, kissed, laughed and hugged and kissed again. She drew away from him, her hands on his shoulders, gazing into his smiling eyes, not sure if she could believe her own eyes or any of her senses. It just seemed too wonderful to be true. Suddenly Janet looked around, spotting a constable. "Quick, Davy, inside with you, man," she exclaimed, gathering her wits. "We cannot be seen out here. There's blue bottles about." "We haven't escaped, Janet. We've been released, then. We're free men." Janet was in a daze, caught off balance. This was the last thing she'd expected. "Come away inside, then," David urged her gently. Michael, beamed with delight, shook hands with all three men and told them he needed a midwife. "Bring Janet up to date and relax for a while, then come back to Irene Rose's. We'll have a celebration." With that he made his way into Mary Upton's cottage, whilst Janet and the three men made their way under the awning into the dining room. Amy Redbank looked up as they entered, recognising James Leach and the others. She looked at her companion, Giuseppe, said she had work to do and wouldn't be a minute. She made her way to the table where they sat. "Ye art a sight for sore eyes. Is this a flying visit? Art on leave?" "I'm thinking we have time for some tea, young Amy," James Leach said with a grin, "providing thou doesn't tell on us to Daniel Moore, Esquire." "I bet you've not had any food," Amy responded. "4 bowls of stew is what you need, I'll be bound." With that she rushed off before anyone could protest. Janet just held David's hand in hers and smiled without saying a word, seemingly oblivious to all around her. Much to her delight, hope seemed to have triumphed over experience for once. In the meantime, Mary Upton had calmly gathered a bag, given instructions to Rosa Joseph, Anna Sutcliffe, Susan Openshaw, Tom Jenkinson and Esther Radcliffe, and was on her way to the Heatherose house, accompanied by a doubly excited Michael. "Irene Rose'll never believe this," he said with a grin all over his craggy face. "I think Irene Rose maybe has other things on her mind this minute," Mary suggested to the father-to-be. "Dunna worry, Miss Rose. Mary Upton'll be here quick as a pig after a pail of porridge." Irene Rose laughed and then winced as she felt another contraction. "I'm not worried at all, Grace. Everything's going to be fine. Have you water on the boil?" "Cook's seeing to it. Have we plenty of towels?" "Yes, Miss Rose. There's just one thing left then, Grace." "What's that, Miss Rose?" "Stop fussing and pacing about the room. You're enough to make the Duke of Wellington nervous. Come and sit here on the bed next to me. Let's see how your reading's coming on. There's a book of Byron's poetry on the bedside table. Read to me, please." Matthew Heatherose sat in his favourite armchair in the library. Constance sat on his knee, whilst little Faith and Benjamin played on the Indian rug in front of the fire. "Mummy Rose'll be all right, won't she, Grandad?" "Of course, Constance, she'll be fine. There's no need to worry." The fluttering of his old heart contradicted his demeanour as he forced himself to remain calm in front of the children. No use letting them know how he felt. Nervousness, like panic, tended to be catching. "Do you think it'll be a girl or a lad?" "I've no idea, my darling. Which do you prefer?" "Another brother would be nice, but I like girls." Matthew grinned and gave her a hug. She seemed the perfect diplomat. "I guess we'll just have to wait and see, Constance, my love. Either way, neither of us will be disappointed, will we, little one?" "Here we are." Amy emerged from the kitchen with 4 bowls of scrag end and mutton stew, each with 4 dumplings floating on the top. 4 large chunks of bread rested on a plate in the centre of the tray she placed on the table. "Tuck in afore it goes cold." James Leach, David and Bernard McCartney didn't need encouragement. They had spoons in their hands and bowls in front of them in a flash, attacking the contents as though they hadn't had a decent meal in weeks. Not surprisingly, as they hadn't. Janet shook her head. "I can't eat. I had dinner afore I come here." "Dinna fret, Janet." Amy turned, looking over her shoulder. "Giuseppe, come o'er here. There's food to be ate," she ordered. "Giuseppe can eat for England and Italy," she confided to Janet. "How he remains so slim and elegant, I'll never know." Janet waited patiently before she asked the big question. "How come you've been let out?" "Powers that be have decided it's safer to let us get free rather than keep us in jail," Bernard McCartney informed her with a grin. In fact, that was precisely the case. Once the verdicts had been announced, they'd been met with a storm of public protest, and the government once more began to panic. The last thing it needed was to rekindle the revolutionary zeal of the labouring poor. However, assistance was at hand. A technical mistake made in framing the charges provided an excuse to free all the prisoners. Exactly what the technical mistake was remained a mystery. From Janet's point of view, it didn't really matter. All the men had been freed, and she was reunited with her beloved. Daniel Ackroyd finally turned up, and young Robert and David caught sight of their father. They escaped Daniel's clutches before he had a chance to realise what was going on, and ran over to the table shouting, "Feyther, feyther," for all they were worth, before they fell about him amidst a great deal of hugging, kissing, laughing, and 1 or 2 tears on their father's part. "Come in, but be quiet, please. Miss Rose is in labour." Cook had answered Daniel's knock and admitted Janet, the children, and the menfolk into the house before shutting the door, escorting them to the library and leaving for her station in the kitchen, much too excited to go and sit with James in the servants' room. Old James was in the kitchen, however. He laughed, caught in the act. Much to her annoyance, he'd taken advantage of Cook's absence to help himself to a cold beef sandwich with pickled onion Cook had prepared for herself. She turned on him, ready to give the coachman a tongue-lashing. He just grinned and placed his index finger vertical in front of his lips. "Shush, Cook, we mun be quiet," he said, a serious look taking over his face. "Mustn't disturb Miss Rose now, must we?" At that moment a baby's cry rang out, reverberating through the great house, and within moments they heard heavy footsteps as somebody bounded down the stairs, seemingly in great haste. Matthew Heathrow stood up, Constance in his arms, and his guests turned around and stopped whatever they were doing or saying as the library door burst open, and Grace shot into the room, a smile all over her young face. "It's a—" She stopped in mid-sentence and frowned for a second. It's a babby," she finally announced, much to everybody's amusement. "Grace," Michael asked quietly, "exactly what kind of babby is it?" She gazed at him blankly. "I dunno. I never stopped to look. I was so excited I just runs to tell you." Her face brightened once more. "It's an O'Donnell babby, that's what it is. For certain sure." Michael laughed and shook his head. "Thank you, Grace, that's very helpful." He rose from his seat. "Excuse me for a moment," he said to all present. "I think I'd better be going to see my wife and find out for myself, so I do." Seconds later they heard him mounting the stairs as fast as Grace had descended, and no doubt even more excited. "Miss Irene Rose said you can all go up now." Grace turned on her heel. Matthew led the party in her wake, carrying Faith and Benjamin, whilst Constance held on to the bottom of his jacket. Daniel held Daniel's hand, and Janet and David held David's and Robert's. James Leach and Bernard McCartney brought up the rear, as they all made their way up the wide staircase. Grace opened the bedroom door wide, stood to one side, and they all filed into the large room. Mary Upton stood by the window. Irene Rose sat up, her back supported by a mass of pillows, the baby in her arms, whilst Michael sat on the side of the bed, one arm around his wife's shoulder as she nestled the side of her head against him affectionately, her long fair hair shining gold against his dark Sunday jacket. The newly blessed father looked as proud as Punch. The mill owner's daughter gazed around the room, smiling with pleasure at her beloved father, her friends and comrades, especially pleased to see James, David and Bernard free long before any of them could have hoped for. Living proof the most powerful and malign forces could be defeated and adversity overcome, even when everything seemed lost. "It's a girl. We have a lovely daughter," Michael eventually informed them, a delighted look on his face. "Have you determined a name?" James Leach asked. "Elizabeth, Liberty, Hope, Michelle, Rose O'Donnell," he said quietly. Irene Rose beamed a smile that lit up the room. "Liberty our aim, hope for our future, our best for short," she exclaimed. "And when our best grows up, despots will flinch and tyrants will tremble." She broke off once more before declaring, "That's a fact, or it will be if I've anything to do with it. We've unfinished business to attend to, a democratic Britain to gain, a new way of life and a world to win." "Amen to that," Matthew Edrose said proudly.